Okay, what we have here is a model, actually a queuing hierarchy used for AAC. And what we see is that the strongest queue, and what we mean by the strongest queue, is the queue that is most likely to elicit a correct response is at the bottom. It's number 8. It's what in this model is called the physical assistant, and it's defined as provide hand-over-hand assistance to help the child to form the message using, it's cut off, sorry. The point is here, basically what we're doing in this AAC is the strongest cue is the one where basically we're doing it for the patient. We're making them do it. What's the least, let's look in the middle. Okay, so what do we have in the, let's say 5? Okay, it's a gestural cue. You can point to the symbol or tap your finger there for several seconds to get the child started with this message, and then they would have to go through. So you're kind of facilitating a little bit. You can then go to an indirect verbal prompt. You can go to an indirect nonverbal prompt, which is even less useful. It's weaker in terms of, is it likely to get the best response? And then the weakest response basically is you just pause, give the child time to respond to do it. You're not giving him any extra information. This is kind of contrological, isn't it? You would think that you would start by giving the patient the most response, the most assistance, the strongest cue possible. Well, we're going to see in a second how this is correct, and what we're thinking is correct perhaps is not. Okay, so let's see how this works out for a patient with aphasia. Okay, again, what we're looking here, and I'm not going to dwell on this, what I'm kind of showing you, there's a couple of slides now, all the different things that we might use to stimulate, to cue, to elicit a response, okay? But none of them is, this is the answer. So I'm going to say this, and you might contradict me, but I think you're wrong if you do that. And I think you should feel free to contradict someone else who says something that's what I'm about to tell you. If the only response you have to a patient who's wrong, okay, patient is asked to name X, and they say Y, and you say, oh, no, it's X, and so repeat it after me, you've done no therapy. You've done no therapy at all. You have not helped that patient an iota. If anything, you've made them totally dependent on you. Because unless you're prepared to walk around with them for the rest of their life and to feed them all the words that they need, you haven't helped them. You haven't taught them a strategy of how they can find a word. You haven't done that. All you've done is you've provided the answer. You know how useless that is when you're learning. Okay? If someone just gives you the answer without explaining it, that doesn't help, because the next time you still won't know what the correct answer is. And so what we're showing here are all the different things that could facilitate, that could help create a strategy. Schul called it what? Do you remember? Remember, it's seeking links to get to a word. We want to find out how to get there. All right. So we can make an association. It reminds me of. A category. It's a group. It's a fruit. It's used for writing. What does it do? It does whatever it happens to be. What are the properties of the item? Okay. Where is it found? Okay. What I'm going to show you now, and this is probably going to end us for today. This is just a data sheet. It's a data sheet that I might establish working with a patient. And again, I'm purely using this as an example. I'm not suggesting for a second that you should always have 6 items and you should always have 5 cues. Not at all. Not at all. This is just for illustrative purposes, just so we can make it simple and make it clear. Okay. I'm going to have items, and again, just for purposes of being simple, we're going to create a naming task. Okay. just tell me the name of certain items. And so the items here will be items that are different from each other, and probably certainly at the beginning, they should have no strong association with each other. So we would not use 6 fruits or 6 writing instruments or 6 colors. We would have different things. Maybe one would be a fruit and one would be a writing instrument and one might be a color and one might be an article of clothing. One might be, I don't know, some other category, okay, a piece of furniture. And they could be names, they could be pictures, they could be real objects, but obviously if we're doing furniture, we probably don't want that. So those are all a matter of logistics. But we probably want the things to be very different from each other with no overlapping associative features. Because if they were all fruits, then, wow, that makes it so hard. There's really nothing to discriminate between an apple and a pear and a plum and a peach, because you're going to say, well, they're all handheld, they're all fruits, they all have a pit, they all have a stem, they all, so what is the difference? Well, we all know the difference, but it's hard to describe. It's really hard to describe. So we want to keep these things as discrete as possible. Okay, and again, 6 is just because that's what fit on my page right now. And I'm going to do something else. I'm going to, again, just for demonstration purposes, we're going to have 5 cues. Okay, and I'm going to rank order these cues. And I'm going to rank order them by the feature of which one is most likely to elicit a correct response, and which one is the least likely to elicit a correct response. In most cases, the thing that will most likely elicit a correct response is a model. Okay? I want the person to say apple. Well, the thing that's most likely to get that person to say apple is to say, okay, repeat after me, apple. Okay? There are some exceptions to that, perhaps, but for most patients, that's what's going to be the strongest cue. Well, I don't want to use that. I don't want to use that very often. I want to use that only as a last ditch, just so I can salvage the therapy. So that's going to be my cue number 5. I don't want to go there. I only want to go there if basically I have not been able to stimulate. I have not been able to elicit the word. Then I'm going to give the patient the word. But that's not therapy. That's just basically salvaging the therapy so it sounds like it worked. And the patient walks away without having failed, but in truth he has, or we have, frankly. Shul would always say we failed. And so let's put the model in number 5. What are we going to put in number 4? Well, we're going to put something that is also not very likely, but at least it's an association. So maybe I'll have the written word. And again, I'm just giving you an example. You have to know your patient. Maybe for your patient, having a written word is a very, very weak cue. Really doesn't get anywhere. But for our patient now, let's just say that the written word actually, he can, at a single word, simple words like that, he can probably get that. So I'm going to have a card that has the word apple. What am I going to have for number 3? Well, for number 3, maybe I'll have a phonemic cue, and I'll say, okay, it's a, and I'll give him the first sound. Okay, I'll give him the first sound. It begins with that kind of thing. We've all done that. We see things like that. And we get mixed results. It's not foolproof, but it's also not something that never works, right? Perhaps number 2 is going to be a semantic cue. It's a fruit. It's red. It's round. We eat it. Whatever happens to work, whatever is appropriate for your patient. And for number 1, we should be working with a very weak. By now, they're getting weaker and weaker as we go up. They're less likely to actually trigger the correct response. So maybe we'll have a rhyme. I can't even think of anything that rhymes with apple, but something that rhymes with pen might be a hen. okay, or something like that. That's not a real strong cue, but let's put that in number 1 because it is a weak cue. Okay, so now, what are we going to do when we actually do therapy? Well, we're going to start, and I'm going to show the patient the first item, and I'm going to say, first, before I give him any cues, I'm going to say, tell me the name of this. And if he gives it to me and he's correct, well, then I'm not going through my cues, obviously, because he's already correct. I probably should have another line in there that just means it was correct spontaneously, in which case we forget that and we move on. But let's assume now that that doesn't happen. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to give the patient a really weak cue, which we defined as a rhyme. Okay. It's not so likely to work, but it might. It might. If we know it will never work, then don't do it at all. But it works maybe 10% of the time, not more than that. We're going to give him that. And let's assume it doesn't work. So I'm going to drop down to number 2, which is a little bit stronger, but not a real good cue. And I'm going to give him that. And let's say that doesn't work. And now we drop down to number 3, and we give him that cue. So we're giving him a little bit more information each time. And let's say that doesn't work. And now we go to number 4, and we give him that, and bam, he gets it. Okay, cool. Are we finished? No. What are we going to do now? Well, now we're going to go back to number 3, and we're going to repeat that cue again and say, and by the way, we're giving the patient reinforcement. We're telling him what's happening. We're not leaving him in limbo. We don't have to tell them that it was wrong because we're going to continue. And that's all that patient has to know to realize that he didn't get that right because we're continuing. But when we give him number 4 and he gets it correct, we say, correct, yes, great, that was good. Okay, so what is this item? And we give him cue number 3. And he's going to repeat it again. And we give him cue number 2 now. And we say, yes, good. And we give him cue number 2. What is this? And he gets it again. And we give him cue number 1. And he doesn't get it. Well, what just happened? Well, it didn't work. It just didn't work. So what do we have to do now? Well, we go back to number 2. Because number 2, it did work. Right? So we repeat that. And hopefully now he will get it again. And now we go back to number 1. And we give him that again, and now hopefully it will work. And now what do? We're not finished. And now we say, great, what is this? And he says it. Well, in the example I just gave you, he gave you 5 correct responses in different modes. He did it with cue number 4, he did it with cue number 3, with number 2, with number 1, and he did it spontaneously. What we're doing is we're reinforcing these search strategies. We're reinforcing these links, these lexical links, phonetic links, semantic links, written links, maybe a gestural one, depending what the cue is. But what we're doing is we're strengthening them and we're reinforcing it. Okay? We never leave the task until he gets it spontaneously. Okay? What if he doesn't? What if he doesn't? What would Schul say? What if he doesn't get it? He just never really does get it. Well, Schul will say, you're making a mistake then. You're at the wrong level. These are bad items. These are bad cues. These are inappropriate. He should be getting it. If he's not getting it at all, he shouldn't get it immediately, because then what are we doing? We're not accomplishing anything. And he shouldn't never get it, because then we're way too high for him. Okay. So he should be struggling in the middle and benefiting. Okay, we're going to stop. We'll come back.